I'm going to take a look at a number 5. This is a 5C corrugated bottom. They call this the jack plane, and we'll take a look here. They call the number 5 the jack plane. I've heard that was just based on the idea of a jack of all trades. If you were going to only own one plane, it's short enough and light enough to be a smoother, and yet heavy enough and long enough to be used as maybe an abbreviated jointer. It's 11.5 inches long, so it's 2.5 inches longer than a number 4. But significantly shorter than a number 6, which is considered a 4 plane. So this jack plane, 11.5 inches long, 1.75 inches wide. This plane I have is a relatively late plane. You can see it has the adjusting screw for adjusting the frog forward and backwards. It's got the larger brass adjusting wheel from a later plane. It's got the tall knob in the front from a later plane, and this one has a corrugated bottom. They also tell me the strategy behind the corrugated bottom was less surface rubbing between the bottom of the plane and the wood, and hence easier to push. I don't know that I buy that. I think if you keep a plane waxed, I just use paste wax on the bottom of my planes. If you keep a plane waxed, I don't notice any difference between smoothing with this corrugated plane or a smooth bottom plane. So I'm just taking this one apart. I'm not going to do much of a tune-up on this except to just clean the parts. The wooden parts were pretty beat up, so I'm going to clean those up, and I'm going to polish all the screws and polish the brass and just give this kind of a facelift. It's a sharp plane. It works great already. It's flat. And so I'm just going to do pretty much kind of a cleanup. And so here I'm removing really literally every part that's removable except for the lateral adjustment lever and the yoke. Sometimes I don't like to press those pins out because you kind of beat up the frog and beat up the edge of the pin. And this one just doesn't seem to need that much disassembly to keep it nice and clean. The body of the plane's in great shape. It's dirty. I'm just going to wipe that out with some denatured alcohol and dry it off, and then put a coat of paste wax on it. Here you can see that corrugated bottom more clearly. I think the roughest part on this whole plane are the wooden parts, and so I'm going to spend some time on those. And then again, I like to just polish the screws and polish the brass. I think it helps the plane to just look nicer. So here I've just put a chuck in my lathe, and here I've just got a screw, wrapped some painter's tape around it until I had a nice tight fit on that brass adjusting knob, jam the screw through the knob, put the screw in the chuck, and then I'm just using very fine sandpaper at first to take off the sort of the corrosion on this brass part. It doesn't take much to bring this brass back to life, so I'm just lightly using sandpaper on it, very lightly, kind of holding it in the grooves. And then what I will do is use a buffing compound. See, look how there's shine there already just from that fine paper. I'll use some buffing compound or some buffing rouge on a rag to get a final shine on that brass part. And the adjusting wheel on a plane is brass, and generally the two screws, the screw that holds the knob and the screw that holds the tote, have brass heads. And so they're super simple to shine and get just a mirror finish with very little elbow grease, just some fine sandpaper and some polishing rouge. And you can bring these to a very, very, very nice shine. Is it important to the function of the plane? Not a bit, but I think it sure makes them look nice on the shelf or in your collection. So there's that part. Here is one of the brass screws. This is the long screw that holds the tote in place. Again, what I do with this brass is start with very fine sandpaper just to get the corrosion off of it. If this brass is buggered up by your screwdriver, you can take a very small file and file in the groove and fix all the rough spots, and it's pretty easy to get those to be just like a mirror. This is the little screw that holds the front of the tote, and again, these are steel screws, but they tend to corrode with just a little time with sandpaper, a little time with some polishing rouge. You can get these to shine. This is the screw that runs the frog forward and backward. Again, it's a steel screw, but just a little bit of time with fine sandpaper and polishing rouge, and you can get that steel to look like a mirror. This is the screw that holds down the lever cap. Same idea. Because it shows, it's right on top, basically, when your plane is sitting on the shelf. It's nice to get a shine in that screw as well. Here is the screw that holds the little collar that does the frog adjustment. I'm getting that to shine too. Now this is the knob. The knob was in pretty rough shape. And what I didn't want to take it all the way down to bare wood, but I wanted to get the big scuffs out of it and to kind of rough the surface. And I found that if you just spin these knobs, rough them up, it looks terrible now, but in a moment when you see that I put some dark stain on it, and then a dark oil stain on it, and then some paste wax, you'll see how this comes back to life. You'll see the shine that look at the shine that you get on this thing, and that's just honestly just a light sanding, a dark oil stain. These are rosewood parts, so a dark oil stain, a little bit of time polishing. I'm literally removing this with a paper towel, and that does a little bit of a buff job, and then I will tighten this up because it keeps wanting to come out of my chuck. I will use some paste wax on it, and again I just apply a thin coat of paste wax. I let it sit and dry for a little while and then come back and buff it. Again, the knob, the benefit of doing the knob is that you can spin it, and so you get a good buffed surface very simply, and that knob looks like $1 million now. You mount that with a newly polished brass screw on a newly polished rosewood knob, and you have a very nice looking front end to this plane. I don't know if I spent more than 10 minutes on the whole thing, but you definitely add a lot to the looks of the plane. Again, nothing to do with operation, but everything to do with looks. The tote on this was in a little more rough shape. I started by just trying to sand it, and I was pretty frustrated. The coat that they put on it from the factory is pretty durable and pretty hard to sand off. So after spending a little bit of time with sandpaper on that tote, I gave up and went to more the nuclear option and filled a little tub with lacquer thinner. And with lacquer thinner and a piece of steel wool, I was able to just basically wipe the finish off of the tote. It was really that easy, just getting it very, very wet with lacquer thinner, using gloves. And lacquer thinner is not all that nasty, honestly, and if you just keep applying it over and over and over again, you'll see very quickly that you'll literally wipe away the finish and get the wood down to, I wouldn't say completely raw state, but down to a state where it will take a stain and a wax job, and you'll have more of a natural looking wood when you're done, and it won't look like a refinish, but it'll look more like an original finish. This tote had just a little bit of staining on it and some, paint splash and stuff like that, but really the tote was in remarkably good shape. No cracks, no splits, full shape. Even the little horn was in good condition. Took just a little bit of scrubbing and maybe 2 or 3 minutes of scrubbing with lacquer thinner. And then I was able to take some light sandpaper to just sand off the fuzziness of the wood, because when you get the wood wet, even with lacquer thinner, you'll raise the grain a little bit. So I kind of knocked off the fuzz with a light paper, then used that same dark stain on the wood, wipe that down, that's an oil stain, and then once I wipe that stain down and let that dry a little while, I put on a coat of paste wax. Paste wax makes for a great finish, I think, for a tote and a knob. Makes them smooth in your hand, and I think they provide a protective finish. The plane is never going to be in a harsh environment, at least mine aren't. They're in a clean, dry, warm shop, and once you get these wood parts fairly well shined up and fairly well finished, they hold that finish pretty much for the rest of the life of the plane. So again, just like with the knob, I applied some of this oil stain, let that sit a while, came back and used paste wax. I put the paste wax on fairly heavy, let it sit a while, and then give it a buff job. And you can see that knob there in the background. That's how shiny you end up getting the wood, with just paste wax and oil stain. So it's a pretty simple finish. So I'm going to reassemble the plane now. The body again was just more or less just dusty. It wasn't full japanned. It was definitely, there was some steel showing through, but all in all, I would say the plane was in good enough shape. Honestly, like the patina of the dark metal. I don't really want it to be mirror-like on the sides and on the bottom, as long as they're smooth. Again, I wax the smooth surfaces. I wax all the surfaces of the plane body, even the painted surfaces, and I think that helps to preserve the plane from light rust. I just gave a very light sanding to the top of that frog and to the 2 spots where the frog rests against the body of the plane. And the frog fits very perpendicular in this plane. Here I am just cleaning it up with a little bit of rubbing alcohol or denatured alcohol just to get the dust out of the cracks and crevices. But all in all, this plane was not that old and not that beat up. You can see that screw is shining after that polish job. And again, I think it's just the small things that make a plane look nice. Makes it look like you take care of your tools. This little part was pretty well tarnished, almost rusty, so I just gave it a super light sanding with some fine paper. Again, is it not important at all to the function of the plane, but when you put it together with a polished screw and a polished brass adjustment knob and a polished tote screw and a polished brass and polished wood, it just adds to the sparkle, and I think it makes the plane look nicer. So, nicely polished screw head, nicely polished little bracket. Put that frog back together, set the frog back in the body of the plane, set the adjustment screw. I usually just air towards a small mouth adjustment and then back it off as I adjust the plane blade flush with the bottom of the plane. I want about a, 1/8 of an inch gap between the blade and the front of the mouth. That's usually where I start, and then I'll just kind of fine tune. So there's that screw right there that adjusts the how the frog moves forward and backwards in these later Stanley planes. So that little saddle just goes down on the groove in that screw. You can see that you can just adjust this. You can easily see where the frog is resting on the body of the plane. Get it within reason. Make sure that it's parallel, or excuse me, perpendicular to the body of the plane, and then just cinch these two screws down. And if you do want to make fine adjustment, you just back those screws off just ever so slightly and use that adjusting screw. Here I am just kind of checking that opening of the mouth. So, looks like I'm out of order a little bit here. I'm back to the polishing of the tote with paste wax, and this is really all I do is just wipe on a really thick coat of paste wax. I do give it some time to dry, sort of cure. I'm not sure it's super important, but they always say to let wax sit a while before you buff it. So I just give this a light buffing, let it sit a while, or a light application of wax, let it sit a while, and then buff it with a dry cloth. And it ended up looking as good as that knob. And you can see the knob there in the background. Not that much time spent in total on that tote. The buffing, I can usually tell when I've buffed enough, is that when you touch the wood surface with just your bare fingers, if you feel any grabbing, you know you've got more buffing to do and more dry time. That it should feel smooth and slick in your hand, not sticky or like it's grabbing. And this paste wax is very forgiving stuff, so it's pretty easy to work with. Now I'm going to put the screw in the front of the tote. Actually, probably better to put this on before you put the frog in, because the lateral adjustment lever generally gets in the way of this screw, but you can get it down there pretty tight. Same here with lateral adjustments in the way of this brass screw. But again, if you move it to the side, you're able to drop that brass screw in and get that tote down there very tight. I get these nice and tight. I don't want the tote to wiggle in my hand at all, and I don't want the front knob to swivel in my hand at all. And so you just can kind of tell when you've got them tight enough to be really firm, because this is really where you come in contact with the plane, and you just don't want that feeble kind of a connection between you and the plane. You want it to be firm. Here I'm just putting the chip breaker on the blade. The blade was already sharp. I'd done that earlier. I usually will try to level the edge of the chip breaker so that when it comes in contact with the plane blade, there's absolutely no gap in between. And I'll usually adjust that chip breaker very close to the point or the tip or the sharp edge of the plane blade. I get it down to maybe a little more than a 1/16, maybe 3/32. And I think that helps. It's just kind of the one last support to the plane blade from vibration. So you just put that into place, put the lever cap on, and adjust it so that you've got a nice tight fit, but loose enough to make adjustments with the adjusting knob. Here I'll use this plane now on some wood in my vise just to show you, once it's cleaned up, how slick this plane works. You can see I'm getting full width shavings off of this piece of wood, nice and thin. Nice thing about this plane is any jack plane, honestly, is they're heavy because they're kind of long. They're 11.5 inches long, yet they're relatively narrow. They're only 1 3/4 inches wide. So kind of the ratio between the heft of the plane or maybe you could say the inertia of the plane and the size of the blade, sort of favor your ability to power it through the wood. And so this plane works great. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If it's the case, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.